Pentagon the Ruthless Conspirator. Pentagon is the symbol of US imperialism to the rest of the world. Though literally, Pentagon is the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense, located in Arlington, Virginia. The building was constructed in pentagonal shape in 1941, and that derives the name Pentagon. But since then, it became the center of all blueprints made by the US imperialists in order to take control of the world. The largest office building, approximately 23,000 military and civilian employees, have become the headquarters of international conspiracies. United States today is enjoying possession of the single conqueror of the world, and its representative institution, the Pentagon's footprint, is firmly planted everywhere. Top administration officials began preparing the Pentagon to go anywhere and do anything while rewriting, shredding or ignoring whatever laws, national or international, stood in the way. The White House looks at the Pentagon before every crucial decision. The Pentagon has marched into states' two traditional strongholds, diplomacy and development. Another despised organization, Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, is like Pentagon's brother-in-arms. But the White House relies more upon Pentagon than CIA, as the power is concentrated there. It is said that the CIA is the spy group that pushes up a condition to war according to Pentagon's plan of action. We should know the history of the invincibility of the Pentagon. The US state was not imperialist from its birth. Gradually, it placed itself as the leader of the imperialist bloc through a path of history covered with blood and tears. The imperialist bloc once was dominated by the Europeans. Until 1870, the United Kingdom reaped the benefits of being the world's sole modern industrial power. As the workshop of the world, the United Kingdom could produce goods manufactured so efficiently and cheaply that its goods could usually undersell comparable locally manufactured goods in other markets. But the long-term effects of the economic depression in between 1873 and 1896 were particularly evident in the United Kingdom, the forerunner of Europe's industrial states. Rise of the US started since then. It first started to show down its imperialist face in 1898. The US government backed thousands of soldiers and landed them in Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam and the Philippines. The War of 1898 was the birth cry of this major new oppressor arriving upon the world stage, US imperialism. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 had declared that all of Latin America was a US sphere of influence. According to the record in Pentagon, the US carried out 103 interventions before 1895, including Argentina in 1852, Japan in 1853, Nicaragua in 1854, China in 1859, and Angola in 1860. After winning the Civil War with the southern slave owners, the capitalists of the United States underwent explosive growth and tremendous transformation. Steam power, machines and electricity were being put to work everywhere, and there were abundance in production. Steel and coal production skyrocketed. Naturally, they had to face with the maneuvers of their rivals in Europe. The core capitalist logic is expand or die. That spurred the US imperialists to lay plans for a global empire. Unable to contend in the contest for Africa, the United States aimed at vying with the European powers in Latin America, the Pacific Rim and China. Spain was rapidly losing its grip on the last of its rich colonies. The US did not want to lose that opportunity. It decided to act before the people of these countries defeated Spain and claimed their independence. The Filipinos found the US beside them in the struggle for independence. Revolutionaries drove the Spanish colonial army out of virtually the whole Philippine island chain. But when the final Spanish surrender came in August 1898, the American commanders refused to allow any Filipinos to participate. US President McKinley claimed God had personally told him that the Filipino people are unfit for self-government, so the US would rule the Philippines for their own good. Aggression in Philippines continued till 1946. After that, the Philippines was declared as independent, but in fact, government, administration and economy, there was the choice of the Americans. With the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904, they declared it was the right of the US to dominate and invade any country in Latin America. There was no delay in executing the declaration. US intervention in virtually every country of Latin America and the Caribbean followed. Haiti has a long story of invasion by the US started from 1915. President Woodrow Wilson did not waste time when an anti-American Rosalvo Bobo was about to form the government. American soldiers landed on another sovereign country. They continued to build up a market for their own interest by deploying a puppet government in the country. Even the custom house was taken over by the US soldiers. Thousands of people had been killed to suppress the protest against the invasion. The number is assumed to have crossed 10,000. But to be the single most powerful imperialist, it had to wait till the World War II. Its rivals in Europe were almost devastated in the war that took place mostly on the land, leaving the US with just a few scratches. So they were well ahead of war-devastated Europe in reconstructing the economy and military.
Vor wenigen Monaten hat sich über der Bewegung ein schwarzer Schatten erhoben. Die SA hat so wenig als irgendeine andere Institution der Partei mit diesen Schatten etwas zu tun. Sie täuschen sich alle, die glauben, dass auch nur ein Riss Sieg heilt.
And surprisingly enough, the Pentagon building was built right at that time when the US had the convenience to proceed to rule over the world. Pentagon has taken the responsibility to manipulate pro-US governments and to force the nations to run pro-US economy. Falling in the trap of globalization and agreeing with the structural adjustment programs, many countries have to get down on their knees with debts. Even the United Nations said that the developing countries cannot reconstruct their economies without getting rid of debts. World Bank and IMF keeps pressuring on developing countries to withdraw public sectors and let them open to the private. Provisions should be open not only to local private entrepreneurs but also to foreigners. This is named as so-called free trade. The consequence is local capital cannot survive with the big imperialist capital. Market goes in control of the giant capital. Americans keep subsidizing in its own land but restricts other to do so. Showing the glamour of high tech, it sells environment-hostile agricultural commodities. Many disputes followed in the WTO meetings, but the Americans are firm on their stand. American policy had a significant shift at the end of the Second World War. It understood quite well that soon after the war ends, the world market would be redistributed. If it does not hold its stake before the ending of the war, it may lag behind. So it went on with newer, sinister plans. The Pentagon was constructed in 1941. The most brutal atrocities took place just 4 years after its establishment. On the 6th of August 1945, it's a date everybody remembers all over the world. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were devastated by the Americans with atomic bombs on the plea to finish off the war earlier and save American lives. But Japan was already cornered and surrendering was just a few days away. But sharp calculation, the bomb was let to explode 1,850 feet higher from the ground to use the most of its destruction power. 80% of people of that locality died overnight. Millions of people became disabled and carrying the horrible experience through generations. It was later disclosed that the Pentagon wanted to demonstrate its military power so that everyone bows down before it after the war. Such was the intensity of its cruelty. Soon after the World War, the Pentagon went with its sinister plans on the plea of fighting communism. To expand the territory of influence, it took every cunning, brutal, deceptive step possible. The United Nations was built mainly from American perspective. Others honestly wanted to make the UN an effective body following the failure of the League of Nations. Roosevelt had long a meeting with Churchill and Stalin with his plans. Another big achievement by the Americans was to convince others in forming the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But it's an irony that the biggest defaulter in the United Nations is the United States, though it takes most of the opportunities from this institution. Americans often use the donation to blackmail the UN. Headquarters of World Bank and IMF are in Washington, D.C. The rule is set to always appoint an American as the president of the World Bank and a European as the managing director of the IMF. But America has always got the power to imply veto on any decision by the IMF. Decisions of the bank will be made by the executive board. Members of the board are all rich countries. Power to vote on any decision depends upon the yearly contribution made by the countries. The US share is the biggest of all. Even in the IMF, America has earned a strong voting right by having 19% of the shares. So it is clear that both the institutions are dominated by American interests. One of the most brutal atrocities was shown by the US military in the war in Korea during 1950 to 1953. The American forces arrived in Korea in early September of 1945. Korea was not divided according to Korean people's choice, but due to imperialist conflicts between USA and the USSR. It's the CIA that provoked North part to attack the South, where the US control prevailed. Pentagon troops took the side of South and fired on civilian refugees. The US Congress at once allocated $12 million. American air raid devastated North Korean cities, even threatened to use the atom bomb twice. The South Korean military, police and paramilitary forces with US military knowledge and without trial executed tens of thousands of leftist inmates and alleged communist sympathizers. Between 3,000 and 7,000 people were shot and dumped into mass graves in early July 1950. The Middle East crisis became critical in 1958. Lebanon was under threat of civil war between Christian and Muslim rebels. Old disputes with Egypt also continued. Taking advantage of the situation, the Pentagon designed Operation Blue Bat. President Eisenhower approved the plan. Lebanese pro-American government chief Camille Chamoun invited US soldiers to resolve the crisis. Pentagon warriors established a military base on the plea to resist communist threat. Suppressing the rebels in the most brutal way, they put a puppet government in power before getting back. Americans had made a strong position in the Middle East at that time. The Pentagon always took the side of autocratic anti-people government. Cuba is a burning example. In 1958, mass movements got pace in Havana against autocratic Batista government. Obviously, Pentagon was on Batista's side and went forward to save him. Embargoes were imposed upon Cuba. The socialist Castro-led party managed to uproot the Batista government and took over power. It seemed that a country cannot even choose an ideology without Pentagon's consent. The Americans feared the Soviet expansion of communism or socialism, but for a Latin American country to ally openly with the USSR was regarded as unacceptable, given the Russo-American enmity since the end of the Second World War in 1945. Such an involvement would also directly defy America's Monroe Doctrine, which held that European powers should not get involved in American matters. In September 1962, the Cuban government saw what it perceived to be significant evidence that the USA would invade, including a joint US congressional resolution authorizing the use of military force in Cuba if American interests were threatened, and the announcement of a US military exercise in the Caribbean planned for the following month. The USSR responded and planned to equip Cuba with some missiles.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup.
America then placed missiles on the Turkish border of Russia as a counter-step.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series